Hi, I'm Anita Diamond, and I'm going to be talking about cognitive ergonomics and technical writing. So, what I'm going to be covering is firstly, naming and terminology. How do we know we're talking about the same thing? Secondly, fast and slow thinking. How can we support people to think deeply about tricky concepts? And then lastly, docs culture. How can we work with organisation culture and behaviours to promote a great docs culture? So a little bit about me. I've got a pretty diverse background. I've worked as a researcher analyst for a consultancy firm, as a journalist in telecoms, as sales and support manager for a software company, and as an IT trainer. But I'm also really passionate about learning. I'm pretty addicted to learning, I'd say, and I've got degrees in information systems, psychology, and anthropology. So what I really love about technical writing is it gives me the chance to fuse those disciplines and interests and create a bridge between people, technology, and business aims, and foster adoption of products through knowledge and understanding, promoting knowledge and understanding. So, which is something I feel very passionate about. But most recently, I've been working in blockchain and crypto. And when I first started, it was a really weird feeling of just being plunged into a whole new world with its own customs and culture and tribes and language. And I now work for a blockchain infrastructure company called Anchor. And I'm really drawn still to the human factor side of crypto, blockchain, and content, as I think it's so often overlooked. So really, that interest is what's led me to want to do this talk. Okay, so let's kick off with how do we know we're talking about the same thing? And this section is really about naming and terminology. It's something that constantly comes up. Trying to explain bleeding edge complex technology in a way that is both useful and comprehensible is super challenging for a number of reasons. So let's have a look at this in action.
For a number of years now, work has been proceeding in order to bring perfection to the crudely conceived idea of a transmission that would not only supply inverse reactive current for use in unilateral phase detractors, but would also be capable of automatically synchronizing cardinal grammeters. Such an instrument is the turboencabulator. Now, basically, the only new principle involved is that instead of power being generated by the relative motion of conductors and fluxes, it is produced by the modial interaction of magnetoreluctance and capacitive directance. The original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing in such a way that the two spurving bearings were in a direct line with a panametric fam. The latter consisted simply of 6 hydrocoptic Marsal vanes so fitted to the ambifacient lunar wane shaft that side fumbling was effectively prevented. The main winding was of the...
So there we have it, an explanation or a partial explanation of the completely fictitious, thankfully, turboencabulator. And I am curious as to how long it took you guys to zone out. For me, it was pretty quick, but if you were able to last any longer than 30 seconds, then I must say, well, I'm impressed. Well done, you. Now, I'm just going to pick up on some of the crazy words in that clip. We just heard about a turboencabulator, and there was mention of magnetoreluctance, capacitive directance, and a panametric fan. So what is it that creates this friction in understanding when we are listening to unfamiliar, long, convoluted words that don't really make much sense? Now, part of the reason is that we just don't understand what those words mean. And our brains learn new words by gauging the context of surrounding words and creating a mental model or internal image of the new word. And it does that by trying to link the new word with more familiar words that we already have a strong mental model of and understand well. So first we are challenged by trying to comprehend the word turbo-encabulator that we can't easily link to existing mental models. And then secondly, the explanation introduces a cascade of more complicated words that are hard to retain long enough in order to decipher clearly, let alone create a context to link them with more familiar words that could aid our understanding. Generally, it just takes longer for the brain to decode low-frequency words like kith compared to high-frequency words like shampoo or slow. So without the linking to more familiar words that we understand and use more frequently, it is hard to build a scaffolding or framework to support our understanding. Another factor here is that we are all familiar with and probably guilty of ourselves is the curse of knowledge when, due to our immersion in a particular subject area, we develop a form of blindness that prevents us from being able to communicate in a way that is accessible to people who are less familiar with that subject area. So here are some strategies that we can use to demystify. First, we can introduce categories. So what happens if we now categorize the turbo-encabulator as a type of engine, the magnetoreluctance as types of bearings, the capacitive directance as energy distributor, and the panometric fan as, well, a fan? We can start to build up a better mental representation because we're more familiar with the words for the categories. The other strategy at work here is that as soon as we write the words down, we've got another mode of perception, visually as well as orally. This also helps to strengthen the mental model. Now, if we can go even further and provide cues to support that understanding, using another means of perception via a diagram, and here we can view the fictitious turbo-encabulator and identify the location of the magnetoreluctance and the capacitive directance and the panometric fan. And we can start to see how they all fit together and begin to decipher how the turbo-encabulator might work. Now, naming and terminology in blockchain and crypto is notoriously tricky. The vocabulary used here can be rapidly shifting, and new terminology is invented on a regular basis, with its usage hotly contested. So here there are two key approaches in this still emerging industry. One is about creating new terminology, and the other is to repurpose existing terminology. So let's look at each of them. Now, agreed terminology and clear definitions have serious implications for financial authorities. They want to determine what a crypto asset is. Is it actually a security, therefore requiring regulation, or is it something else, not requiring regulation? Under US law, a security includes an investment contract, which is defined as an investment of money in a common enterprise with a reasonable expectation of profits to be derived from the entrepreneurial or managerial effects of others. So Tesla shares are securities as a common enterprise is Tesla, and the entrepreneurial or managerial efforts of others are the management and staff of Tesla. Now, Bitcoin has been defined as a crypto asset because there is no central or common enterprise or person that controls it. Anyone who holds Bitcoin is a part of a distributed Bitcoin network. However, another crypto asset called Ripple has been labeled as a security in the United States because it was generated, distributed, and sold by Ripple Labs, who are seen as a common enterprise controlling Ripple. To make things even more ambiguous, other countries like Japan and Switzerland have declared that Ripple is not a security, but is in fact a crypto asset. So there is no consistency amongst countries and different regulatory authorities, and there is currently an ongoing lawsuit between Ripple and the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, due in large part to the impact and nailing down of new terminology. Now let's tackle repurposing existing terminology. The most common mental model for a term called Layer 2 before blockchain has been in relation to the network communications model, where Layer 2 refers to the data layer. However, in blockchain, Layer 2 has been repurposed to refer to a network or technology that operates on top of an underlying blockchain protocol to improve its scalability and efficiency. So they are quite different concepts. There have been various attempts to map this new usage to its original usage, but they don't transfer smoothly, and these attempts to do so often contradict each other and create confusion. So how can we smooth the reappropriation of terms? It's a good idea to create a glossary, and then every time you refer to a word that might be problematic, you can insert a link to it. And repetition of the word as well as the link to it in its new usage can help to encode it as a memory and support that understanding. But if somebody wants to evaluate the technology, then they may need all the details up front. But this can be quite inaccessible. So a clear context is needed just to explain its purpose, and ideally explained more straightforwardly and appropriately. So, for instance, if our audience is in the middle of completing a task in an app, they just don't need to know all of this information here. We can just give them a link if they want to find out more. So, in general, what we call things and how we refer to them is heavily dependent on context. And we really just want to be providing the least amount of information to do a specific task and providing information in the right place at the right time. If we focus on information needs during a user's journey, we can minimize the effort for our user by only providing what is needed. For example, I want to know the fees or gas price of a transaction just at the point in time when I want to make the transaction. I don't want to know afterwards, nor do I want to know the intricate details of how transaction costs are derived at. I just want a figure. Anything more than that is just annoying. So on this note, what happens if we need our audience to think more deeply than they are comfortable with? And this leads us nicely into our next topic, which is how can we support people to think deeply. And I am referencing Fast and Slow Thinking here by Daniel Kahneman. So Kahneman describes two distinct modes of thinking. The first is System 1, which is what we use most of the time, and it's an instant kind of quick-fired process of how we interpret information. So it's probably what we're using to recognize faces or drive to the supermarket, and it takes lots of shortcuts, and it's these shortcuts that tend to lead to errors, poor decisions and biased judgments, unfortunately. So System 2, on the other hand, is a less used system, and it's a more depthful way of processing information. It tends to be the one that we use to play chess or perform calculations. We don't really want to use it, and the reason is because it just requires so much effort. So I'm going to talk through an example of when we would be using System 1 thinking and how we might be coaxed into using System 2. So typically it is super easy to get through signing up for a user account on an app, let's say for a subscription or shopping. We tend not to really think too much. We just work on autopilot, name, address, email, confirm, blah, blah. And we only really perk up maybe a little to check or uncheck a box so that we don't get any marketing bump at the end. And we just continue like this until we can get access to the app that we want to get access to. But signing up for a crypto wallet is quite different. The master seed is a randomly generated list of 12 to 24 common words and is a crucial part of the creation of a crypto wallet. This master seed, or these 12 to 24 words, they are what's used to derive your keys and therefore enable you to access your account and your funds. And you can take your master seed anywhere in the world and recreate your crypto wallet on any mobile device. But if you lose this list of words and you lose your crypto wallet, then you lose all your funds. That's it. There's no customer support team. This means that all users really need to understand the importance of the master seed and how to look after it. You can't keep it online, as it can also get hacked there. So people need to write it down manually during the sign-up flow, and they need to store it somewhere, because essentially that piece of paper with your 12 or 24 words written down is the equivalent of a bank. Now, this poor guy, Stephen Thomas, lost £200 million because he forgot his master seed, and the world is full of distressed people who have lost their master seed. This sign-up flow seriously requires System 2 thinking, and there have been some really interesting attempts to resolve this. Now, MetaMask is a very popular crypto wallet now, and they decided to rename the master seed to Secret Recovery Phrase, which was a really great idea because secret is a much more commonly understood word, and it supports the creation of a mental model associated with keeping something private and safe. Another way to get people to use System 2 thinking builds on the limited capacity of working memory and how we can really only hold maybe 7 plus or minus 2 items at a time. Now, as I mentioned, the master seed is a minimum of 12 words, or frequently it's 24. So we just can't really retain these words in our working memory easily at all. However, the sign-up flow requires users to manually enter all or some of their 12 or 24 words into the user interface of the app in order to get to the next stage of the flow. There's just no way to unconsciously sign up for a crypto wallet. The shortcuts are eliminated, so the ability to copy and paste the master seed is disabled. The ability to take a screenshot is also disabled. There's just no way out. You have to use System 2 thinking to record the master seed offline, and then even deeper thinking is required to work out what to do with that piece of paper. Now, the master seed issue is one that has just not yet been fully resolved in a properly usable way. And in the meantime, we'll just end up seeing more headlines like this one. So essentially, I don't think we can separate technical writing from UX. I think a great user experience is inseparable from a great information experience, and it's only through having the right amount of information at the right time in the right format that information becomes information instead of noise. And this does mean focusing on who our audience groups are and conducting user research to identify their pain points throughout their user journey, and then resolving them alongside design teams. And then displaying that information where it's going to be most useful, whether that's going to be inside the app user interface or within help modals or links to further information, or in a pop-up even of the relevant page from a doc site. And I think the best way to engage users is creatively across as many sensors as possible. So repeating the information via YouTube videos, visuals, or audio recordings, as well as text-only documentation. Now, let's just wrap this one up with, technical writing is UX. So let's now move to our final topic, docs culture. How can we work with organisational culture and behaviours to promote great docs? So what do we mean by a great docs culture, and how can we tell the hallmarks of one that's great? So first I would say that having a culture where there's already an active collaboration and sharing of knowledge across disciplines and a real kind of openness about learning and offering our skills to each other it can be a really good indicator. And then there's also an awareness of the whole docs life cycle, so not just about the creation of documentation, but also the maintenance, curation, and then the archiving of out-of-date, irrelevant documentation. Then there's also an interest and awareness of the importance of measuring the documentation impact. So it's wanting to ensure that the docs are getting read and people are finding them useful, and supporting the capture of user feedback to constantly improve. And then I would say another indicator is the quality of the internal documentation. So how organised it is and whether it's up to date. And often that can be really tricky for very fast moving startups. And sometimes there are other impediments, or not so much impediments, but just areas that might need to be tweaked to really improve the docs culture. Now, I think this is really important and often overlooked, and I think you can tell this is happening when firstly people will have preconceptions about technical writing that don't quite fit. So it's very much about aligning our approach with and fitting it in with that organisation culture or the team's way of doing things, and seeing where we can provide benefit or educate people. And I think that's, for this first one about people having preconceptions about technical writing, I think that can be really helpful to define a docs process and educate co-workers about it and the value of good writing. And I think sometimes it's just not clear. You've just got people calling you from all over with some sort of random docs requests, and it can quite quickly get overwhelming. And the next thing is where, and this is something that's very, very frequent, which is about docs being an afterthought at the end of a sprint, the very end of a sprint. And this can be really stressful, and it's kind of like a race to get them done, and it compromises on quality. So one of the best ways to do this links up with the UX approach, which is being involved very much at the beginning of the project to ensure completeness and quality, and again getting that optimum alignment between what goes into the user interface and then what can go into a documentation portal. And then thirdly, part of this I think is about getting sponsorship, from a leader or a senior person to kind of really help to embed you there at the beginning rather than at the very end. So, and also, to demonstrate the effectiveness of this approach is devising a way to measure success. Now, another issue around docs culture is when there's just too much emphasis on the one person to document for everyone. And here it's really great to empower people and build up that awareness of docs and how great it is when people understand what we do, and giving people the skills to contribute. So this can be showing people the style guide and maybe demoing it, creating writing workshops so that people who want to be able to write better or just don't know how can learn some useful skills. And I think that's really helpful when we work in such an international environment. And also the use of templates is really great. So patterns for tutorials or quick starts can just make it that much easier to contribute. And I've previously offered like drop-ins where different teams, different projects can just drop in and discuss what doc system they're wanting to adopt, or how they might better organise their information architecture. So it's great to have that kind of visibility, although times of COVID make it really different. And I think the other point about creating documentation systems that work with existing behaviours is really crucial, because if it's not a good fit, then people just won't really use it. And I think I found that with like internal teams and the existing documentation system being Confluence, but actually when the audience was mainly developers and people who are very technical, and in that instance it just made more sense to move to a Docs as Code approach, and that worked better for everybody. And then there is the issue of documenting without a clear purpose. And this is kind of linking back to the process, the writing process, and bringing awareness of that. So it's a good idea to create a sort of template or some sort of way for people to request documentation, and this can be as like a user story, and ask for evidence, of the need and what's the result that we're looking for. So where is it coming from? Is it like a particular client is needing some technical details, or is there feedback from users who are just constantly getting stuck on this one thing, or recurring support tickets? So those can all really help. So that's pretty much me done now, and I was moving myself across there. But thank you so much for listening, and thanks to Anchor, where I'm working now, for their support and encouragement. And we are recruiting, so feel free to check out the anchor.com website, and we're really keen to employ women and improve diversity, which is pretty much something that's relevant across tech. But I really hope you've got something out of this talk, and I've really enjoyed delivering it. So stay in touch, and thanks very much. Keep writing.
I admit, when I first saw the name for your talk, starting with cognitive ergonomics, I had a bit of a hard time understanding what you were referring to, but then very soon I caught on. I also hadn't heard of this Daniel Kahneman book, but I will check it out.
Cool.
Yes, so quite a few questions and about 10 minutes to get through questions. I suppose, okay, well, on the topic of information experience, which I think a lot of people were pleased to see, Anna Karina had asked, what are your thoughts about the current inclusivity level of UI, docs, and products when it comes to neurodiverse individuals?
Yeah, I really like that question. I saw it come up, and I thought, yeah, that is so important. And so again, one of these things that just gets overlooked. And I really think, as technical writers, we really should be advocating for our users, and being aware, I guess, of all the of how people can be, have different modes of receiving information and or engaging with it. And I think that's possibly maybe one of the things to tackle in user research process, ideally, making sure that there's some sort of representation there. or some kind of bridge to understanding that. But I also do think that sometimes there's a real, it's about finding a balance between a company that really wants to produce quick iterative changes in a single sprint, that may not necessarily allow the time needed to engage with people. But I think then also just trying to understand or read what's out there. I think probably in design, design best practices, which would be much more clued up, I think, about neurodiverse issues. But I really like that question. I thought it was it's really significant. Good one.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if we are, or we collectively, or if a lot of us are fooling ourselves by thinking that there's less neurodiversity than there actually is, or that there's some concept of normalcy that we adhere to when we create software or write documentation for those tools. I will go ahead and go on to another question. In the meantime, Victor Slaughter. Victor had asked, how do you determine what to document? Not on a page-by-page basis, but more in terms of architecture design, perhaps.
Yeah, that's also a good question. I mean, I think here, I think on top of the user research, I guess it depends at what stage you're at with your product. If you've got existing users, then you can kind of gauge where maybe their issues are with support requests, or community channels, or if the product's not yet come fully to market, then it's more important to focus on doing user research with, say, like a critical mass of like 5 users. But I think the other aspect of that is to make sure to match that with business goals. So it's not just about the users, but your company is going to be having some sort of motivation or some kind of pathway that they're kind of trying to push your users onto as well. So I think it's kind of like finding the best the overlap between all of those, and then but very much thinking about the whole user personas. I think the end-to-end sort of user journey is the most important thing to be documenting, and I think that should be guiding your information architecture. I hope that's helpful.
I think it makes sense. More questions coming in, and we did have a few questions about defining terminology. Anja had asked, where do you think it is ideal to provide new definitions? Perhaps at the beginning of a section or a chapter, or maybe in the middle of a reading when we come across its usage?
Yeah. So I guess there it depends on what the medium is, right, of publication. So I guess I was sort of thinking more about a static doc site, in which case, I think particularly with the crypto words, I think the key thing there is about the repetition. So and just always making it handy, because it just depends what page someone has entered your docs on. So they may not necessarily take that linear path through your glossary and and then into the section that they're interested in. So I think it's good to have both, ideally, where you've got both the glossary, and then you're linking to it constantly each time you mention the word. Yeah, so I say that, but I mean, I think it's also another thing that's iterative, because ideally you'd have that terminology that was agreed.
It's a big if.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, are there any specific static site generators that you would recommend that make it easier to create a glossary?
Yeah, no, this is something that I'm often asked about, and I think I do tend to steer away from anything proprietary, and then I think in terms of ones that are easy to provide a glossary for. So I've not used any that like would auto generate a glossary, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, that is what I mean. I mean, in my mind, it was probably a bit of a leading question because I haven't worked that deeply with that many different static site generators, but I know that Sphinx will allow you to enter some restructured text syntax and define glossary terms in place and on a given page, and then perhaps you link to a separate glossary page and so on. But I would love to know about any other tools that are out there.
Oh, that's really interesting, actually. I've
Yeah.
not that. No. So I haven't come across any tools
Mhm.
that have that specific functionality, but I mean, I tend to use Docusaurus, and I think that's probably
Oh,
because it's the one I'm most familiar with
nice.
and seems to sort of just work out of the box. But yeah, I mean, then there's all, I know that is it markup that
Mhm.
can't remember, something beginning with M. There's another one. But I know those are kind of probably the easiest to get working out of the box. So
I got the tools based in Markdown language or syntax or whatnot. Or
yeah, no, there was another one that I called MKDocs.
MKDocs, that's also written in Python. Yeah, I did like that one as well.
Yeah.
Ooh, Lucas has also
Oh, cool. There's
added some bits in the
yeah.
chat. Thank you, Lucas. A couple more questions about terminology. See, Lydia had asked, how do you go about unifying repurposed and new terminology, getting them to meet in the middle, so to speak?
Wow. Well, I think that is a really good question. I think it's also, let's see now. I think the important thing to do there is to embed it into a user flow, and I mean that's certainly something that I've done before. To when there's been for instance, like the use of the word check, meaning one thing, and then also being used within the same documentation to mean something else, causing a lot of confusion. So I think it's just important to just explain like the term and then contextualize it within the process. So you've provided that whole kind of map, and then you're more focusing on the functionality of the word, if that's where that's relevant. And but I think otherwise, yeah, I mean, getting them to meet in the middle, I mean, sometimes they just don't, so I mean, definitely with the layer 2 thing, I just don't think that was that was an endeavor worth really going on. So I think it's then just just clarifying really what the new meaning is.
Yeah. Thank you. One more question from Tabea. Tabea had asked, do you recommend using the same terminology internally and externally? At work, we often use a code-led terminology internally and a sales-led terminology externally, which is useful, but sometimes confusing.
Yeah, that does really lead to confusion. I mean, I think it's really natural that happens, and but I think then you can end up in situations where your website is saying something using a certain language that isn't then mirrored in the documentation, or in your other channels. So I think it's worthwhile working on terminology collectively, where possible, to trying to get an agreement, because I think there's nothing worse than having different terms used differently in different places.
Yeah, I feel that. We are at the beginning of the lunch hour, so I'm just going to share an announcement about the lightning talks, which are going to begin after lunch. I think we have 5 speakers, if I'm not mistaken. Eugene, Coley, Tibbs, Choco, and Emily. So thank you so much just hit something here. Thank you all for signing up and submitting your submissions. And thank you, Anita, for your presentation.
Thank you.